which was on this an average of about plus 10 dB at the high level for the SNR and about minus 10 dB at the 0.1 watt, that's pretty linear. And I did that with several different times with several different receivers. Found it was a bit of a challenge to find conditions that were stable enough to allow this, but I was able to get that kind of data. Now, there is a problem, and I'll discuss it in a minute, that the low end of the SNR range is really tricky to interpret because WSPR can decode signals at negative 31 dB, but there's so much variability that if you're trying to average, if the average is below about negative 25 dB, there are probably quite a few spots that are below the WSPR detection limit. And so what you end up with is artificially high estimates of signal to noise ratio if you average. And so you really need to be careful if you have weak reception of your signal in terms of making any quantitative conclusions. On the high end, it looked to me like WSPR was linear to at least plus 15 dB, but I did find occasional receivers that were receiving my signal above plus 15 dB. And in looking at all the signals they were receiving, they were often receiving several strong signals and completely missing the low-level signals. And so there is a dynamic range of individual receivers problem that can also cause some potential difficulties with using WSPR data. But it does at least appear to be one, resolution to within a dB with perfect conditions and a reasonably linear dynamic range from about, this just did something odd, from about negative 25 or negative 20 or so up to at least plus 15. Then, as everybody knows who uses WSPR, there's a real problem with noise. And the difficulty is, how do you separate noise from actual propagation differences? And there are all kinds of noise. And in this, I cite Griffiths et al., who are obviously Gwyn Griffiths just talked, because they did a very interesting paper in QEX on noise. And I corresponded with them, but haven't been a good correspondent in getting back to them. At any rate, I was also looking at the question of what is the noise like. And my graphs here just show the first one is looking at a ground wave signal received by KPH in California. And KPH disappeared about mid-year. I'm not sure what happened, maybe the COVID problem and getting to maintain it. But at any rate, at night in that quiet area that KPH is in, you can see in the graph that you have very, very stable, unvarying spots. But even in that quiet area in the day, there's quite a bit of noise. Again, this is on 20 meters. So this is a ground wave signal received by KPH. Second one is my signal received on ground wave by WB8SCG, who's about 40 kilometers away from me. And again, you can see that at night, the noise is less and not very variable. In the day, there's more noise and it's quite a bit more variable. So there's no way from these spots to determine the absolute noise level. And Griffiths et al. Addressed that in their QEX paper and have been using WsprDaemon. But my conclusion is there's a real need to average in order to make use of WSPR data. The problem with that is that in achieving some degree of precision with the signal to noise ratio, you lose time precision, which could be something that would be important if you're looking at, say, sunrise and trying to see what's going on there. I also was looking at how do things vary over a year, and I have an enormous amount of data, and I wasn't able to analyze a whole lot of it for this presentation. So I'm just going to quickly show you some graphs. This is AI6VN/KH6 in Hawaii, and I believe he's sitting here in the poster session too. And that just shows that this is from February 22nd to March 8th of this year and last year, just showing the blue line is 2020, the red line is 2021, and there's on the average about a 3 dB improvement. Same thing if you look over at whoops, where did I go? That's EA8BFK in the Canary Islands, AI6VN /KH6 in Hawaii, both about a 3 dB improvement, but you really need to be careful about interpreting it that way because of the dynamic range issue, that if you look at this graph here, it's a scatter plot of the mean received signal to noise ratio in decibels versus the standard deviation. And you can see that as you go up in signal to noise ratio, the standard deviation also goes up, meaning there's a wider spread. When you're down in a low signal to noise ratio, there's a very low standard deviation, probably due to a whole lot of missed spots that are below the threshold. So again, quantitative comparisons can be very tricky if you're down in that lower signal to noise ratio range. So you have to be careful about taking things. Right here is the minus 25 dB line. I would say you really got to watch out for anything below minus 25 dB. And I've heard people say really anything below about minus 20 dB you should be careful about in terms of using those means. Another interesting thing is I was trying to do this at the bottom of the solar cycle, but it's come up a little bit. Solar flux is higher, and so that's a problem. You know, if I wanted to get everything at the solar minimum. And then a serious uncontrollable variable is what if the receivers change? I've been seeing in the whole meeting how the problem with ham stations is sort of unpredictable as to what will go on. And it's quite possible that any of the receivers who have been receiving my signal have made some kind of change in the receiver and the antenna or the local background noise. One way to solve it is to just look at a lot of different receivers looking for consistencies and inconsistencies. An alternative is to prearrange for them to make no changes in their configuration for a year, or ask them in retrospect what changes they've made on what dates over the past year. So I think AI6VN is here today, so he can tell me if that Hawaii station made any changes that I should know about in analyzing my data. And then finally, this just shows I've been talking a lot about traveling and transient ionospheric disturbances. This is just an example that I have here of basically a moving patch. Now the stations that I received, or rather that received me, were up here, but actually I decided to look at how they were being received in Texas down here. So I think the actual patch is probably somewhere around here in the middle. This was basically several hours before sunrise, and what appeared to be a traveling patch that made very, very strong reception of these stations before sunrise, and then reception went away completely for 3 hours, and then reappeared with sunrise. And so just an example of how WSPR might be used to track moving ionized patches. And again, this was several hours before sunrise and then disappeared for several hours, but it was a patch that seemed to be moving toward the southwest. I would assume probably somewhere within here. And so that's...
You need to wrap.
I'm wrapped.
Okay.
That's it for me.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Doug. That's pretty interesting. Lots of good data. Next, we're going to hear from Jeanette, KN6DAD. Her poster is Characterization of Sporadic E-Propagation in WsprDaemon Spot Records. So unshare your screen, Doug.
I'm trying to figure out how to unshare my screen now. That's
if the next presenter just tries to share their screen, it will just replace it.
Oh, it says that I can't screen share while another participant is.
Oh, okay. So I guess you do need to.
Okay, so I'm trying to figure out how to unshare my screen.
Now you should be able to. I just.
Is that unshare?
No, I just added the option for multiple participants to share.
There you go.
I just hit stop share, so I think
Okay.
I'm done. And
Yeah.
I will turn off my mic.
Try it now, Jeanette. I think you should be okay, right? There you go.
Yep. Looks good, Jeanette.
So my presentation today is about the characterization of sporadic E-propagation in WSPRNet records. As we heard from the last two presentations, you can use WSPR encoded data to study propagation, and more than 100 million spot records are available on WSPRNet. And while WSPRNet provides a potential big data source for study, it's not clear if the WSPRNet data is of good enough quality or representative enough to be useful in studies of sporadic E-propagation. So the first objective of the study was to see if these records were of good enough quality for study, which could then open up new opportunities for using big data for analysis of sporadic E-propagation. So to start the study, I downloaded WsprDaemon data. I only used it from 2020 because otherwise it'd be too computationally intensive for my computer to handle. I then used Python 3.8 with Jupyter Notebook with pandas and Maidenhead packages to conduct the data analysis. And when I did this, I filtered out repeats, any transmission that was of a distance less than 1,200 kilometers. And I focused on 28 megahertz, 50 megahertz, and 144 megahertz because they're generally used for sporadic E-propagation. And then I ended up with about just over 1 million data points. And then I split my data into northern and southern hemisphere. And I was able to find that there were peaks in the summer for the northern hemisphere, and with the opening starting in about April and dying down in September for 28 megahertz and 50 megahertz, and the 144 megahertz band starting later around May or June and having a second peak around October. And in the southern hemisphere, I found the sporadic E-propagations are mostly during the winter up until March and starting again in October for all 3 frequencies. And I noticed that the observed seasonal changes seem to be consistent with known literature about sporadic E-propagation. And so with this confirmation, I thought that the WSPRNet spot records seem to reflect sporadic E cloud formation. So then I tried to analyze the relationship between global solar indexes and sporadic E-propagation. And so I downloaded data from the German Research Center for Geosciences. And when I graphed that data, I noticed that the average indices have generally lower values during the summer. So I tried to graph it with the 2020 WSPRNet dataset. And I found that when I plotted it with the hourly KP index, there was a negative correlation with an R² value of 0.62 for 28 megahertz, which indicates a relatively strong effect, and an R² value of 0.46 for 50 megahertz and 0.4 for 144 megahertz, which suggests a modest effect. And while the preliminary analysis of the 2020 data seems to suggest a strong negative correlation, further study is needed to clarify this relationship. And so I guess in conclusion, the study suggests that the WSPRNet record after cleaning could be a big data source for studying sporadic E cloud formation. And when I was looking at the reporting stations, I noticed that there were a lot of reporting stations in the United States, which could be used for a regional study where we could look at sporadic E cloud formation in local geographic areas and look into correlations between sporadic E and weather data to see if there are any correlations with that.
Okay, is that it, Jeanette?
Yeah.
Well, I look forward to next year when maybe you can maybe show some correlation to terrestrial weather. That would be interesting. So thank you very much, Jeanette. Next up is Hans, ZS6AKV. He's going to talk about the Beacon program to study inland Tropo in South Africa. Hans, it's all yours. You got to unmute yourself for one thing. There we go.
Right, sort of good evening from South Africa. Now I need to look at how to share my screen
Okay.
and how to pull up the poster session. I think the poster is here.
There it
Yeah,
comes.
okay.
Yep.
Okay. Right. I'm presenting the first part, and the second part will be Brian Jacobs, Set of 6 Yankee Zulu, who is also in the room number 2 this evening. The interesting thing is that we have noticed for some time that there's a very strong tropospheric propagation taking part in the coastal areas of South Africa. The interesting perhaps is that the west coast, which is right down south, actually has the best propagation or tropospheric propagation. And it's interesting that we have quite a number of contacts with St. Helena, which is some 2,000 kilometers away. We, however, are not aware of regular inland tropospheric propagation. We know that it has happened, but it's never been actually recorded, because the problem is when it happens, we may not have somebody sitting at his transmitter or somebody sitting on the receiving end at the end of the channel. So that's one of the kind of problems we've got. But if you just listen what happens here in St. Helena, and I'd like to just play you that QSO.
Thank you once again for the 58 contact, and we actually managed the JS8 call where you did receive my heartbeat. So we'll try again later tonight on the JS8 call side. So back to you, Gary. Zulu Delta 7 Golf Whiskey Mike from ZS1 Foxtrot Charlie. ZS1 Foxtrot Charlie.
So you can see that the actual communication between the west coast of South Africa and St. Helena is pretty good. And this tropo seemed to happen regularly. And of course, it's pretty predictable because the Hepburn charts are pretty accurate to show that. But we never see really any Hepburn activity or Hepburn chart activity on an inland like the circuit between Cape Town and, say, Johannesburg, which is something like about 1,000 kilometers. The other thing is that we then constructed the beacon. It was a CW beacon, and it was put up in a place called Bethlehem in the Free State Province, which is around about sort of near enough midway between the Cape and the northern part of South Africa. And the problem with that beacon is that it was received regularly, but you could not really record anything because to really have a successful beacon program, one would need a reverse beacon facility where you have permanent beacon stations running. That's easy enough. But you also need a number of reverse beacon stations around the country so that you could be alerted when such an opening takes place. And then we found that the way to do that would perhaps be using CW skimmer, but we found that it wasn't really that effective because CW skimmer doesn't necessarily will receive the signal when it's low. It needs quite a high level of signal, and that means there's many of the tropo signals you would miss. So we then decided, well, let's discuss another way of doing it, and we came across a thing called the next generation beacon. It's very well documented, and you can see in the reference the website where that is. And also, it's widely used in Europe. And in Europe, actually, it's one of the oldest beacons on 144 megahertz that is using the next generation system. So I'd like to invite Brian to talk to us about the next generation beacon and the development that's taking place, and the beacon that we have just recently installed at a test site here in Pretoria. And then that beacon, as soon as the tests are completed, will then be moved to the Bethlehem site, where we already have the various facilities that are already there. There's a nice mosque there, and it has all kind of like, it has 2 antennas on it with the power sharing, and one antenna points north and the other one at the moment points east to KwaZulu-Natal, or the Durban area, for those of you who are not too conversant with our provinces. So Brian, would you like to talk to us about the next generation beacon project that we've started?
Thanks, Hans, and good evening to everybody. It's evening here by us. So Hans, can you just open the drop down for us on the next generation beacons? Okay, so the next generation beacon generates a machine-generated message similar to WSJTX and the other digital modes that we are familiar with. And what happened is, while we were figuring out why we couldn't receive the CW system successfully, some of the guys in the group started playing with digital modes on 144 megahertz, and they discovered that JS8 call, which has got a beaconing function, actually worked very, very well. And that is what led us to looking at the next generation beacon platform that has been developed in Denmark. So the next generation beacon software uses actually PI4 as its digital mode that has been written by the guys in Denmark. And a couple of things that we found is that there's a lot of different digital modes that one could use, but we discovered that not all the digital modes are actually operate the same, and the digital modes have been designed with specific propagation types in mind. The other big advantage of using PI4 is that it's totally free software. If we look at the price of CW Skimmer at $75 a license, for us in South Africa, that's very, very expensive. So the PI4 was also very attractive to us in that way. So the nice thing about the next generation beacon, it doesn't only generate a machine generated message in PI4, it also generates a beacon ID in CW, and it also sends out a frequency accurate tone to allow us to do frequency calibration on our equipment. Now here in South Africa, we've actually got a licensing requirement that every station must have frequency measurement equipment. But the interesting thing is nobody specifies what that equipment must be like, what is the accuracy of it, and so forth. When we're working at HF frequencies, frequency accuracy is not really that critical, but the higher up you move into VHF and microwave bands, frequency accuracy and stability becomes very, very critical. And most operators just simply haven't a clue how accurate the equipment is and even their radio, and they are always hunting around for the signal, trying to decode it and so forth. So the next generation beacon is actually consists of a VCO and phase lock loop board, which provides a stable GPS discipline frequency to the reference, frequency reference to the DDS. The DDS, or the direct digital synthesizer, generates the modulated signal at the desired frequency. In our case, it's 144.4 4 to 5 megahertz. And then we have a GPS, which is used to provide the reference signal or the reference frequency to the VCO and the phase lock loop. And it also provides timing for the direct digital synthesizer to ensure the accurate timing of the message being generated. And then, of course, the last component of the beacon is a RF amplifier, which is basically just a Mitsubishi brick that amplifies the signal from the direct digital synthesizer. And then filtering is applied to it, normal filtering, as we have in all the power chains on our radios, low pass filter to clean up the signal. So the progress of the project at the moment is we've actually got the beacon up in test phase here in Pretoria, as Hans mentioned. It's currently running an output power of 25 watts into 2x14 element stacked Yagi antennas and approximately 15 dB gain. And then once it's fully tested, it will be moved to replace the current radio at the beacon in Bethlehem. Now, what's very, very interesting in the first week, not even the first week, in the first 2 days of the beacon being live on air, it was actually received by one of the members of our work group on the south coast of Natal, which is 567 kilometers away, and it gave fantastic results. And in a period of the afternoon that he was monitoring, he had 88 hits where the beacon was actually received. And he determined that during that time, between 2 o'clock in the afternoon till 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there was actually a very good tropospheric opening between Pretoria and the south coast of Natal. So that is absolutely great information for us because it validates the whole project, and it gives us now a chance to be able to actually monitor the beacon consistently and continuously, even when nobody's in their shack, and provide information on that we can then now go and use to determine when we're actually getting tropospheric propagation and when not. And it will open up a whole world for us with new information that we've never known before. So that's the status of the project, and it's actually now becoming a very exciting project because we're actually getting usable data from it.
Okay. Is that
Okay,
it?
Brian, thanks very much. Just to wrap up, and that is this is the first beacon. We're also planning one in the Northern Karoo, which is sort of like 500 kilometers, 600 kilometers south from Johannesburg, and also one in Cape Town. So these are the 3 beacons that are planned, and the one 00 BET in Bethlehem, which sort of like the center, will be activated, as Brian said, soon. So yeah, that's our story. And sorry, we had lots of problems with the iPoster. This morning we lost everything, and well, the explanation they gave us, they say it was a hiccup in the internet, but we're not sure. But we got most of it back, but now it doesn't seem to want to open the way it should. Anyway, I trust you'll be able to look at the iPoster in more detail at leisure. Thanks very much.
You're quite welcome, Hans and Brian. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm sure people will go look at it after these sessions are over. Next up is Nolan, KE8JCT, and he's going to talk about simulation and comparison of weak signal VHF propagation. Nolan.
All right. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
I think I am sharing now. Does this work for everybody?
It looks like it's going to work. Yep, here it is.
All right. So I will go ahead and begin. So at the beginning of the semester, last semester, I was really interested in looking at, first of all, communicating being weak signal. We just got a new ham station with all these directional antennas and this VHF rig, and I really wanted to see why and how does this propagation up in the VHF range work how it does. So my kind of question was, is characterization and analysis and some simulation of this weak signal data, is that going to help us identify when and where and how to transmit? So really, we looked at some key equations for this propagation loss. We examined some key parameters, the path loss. If you go EME, you have about 250 decibels of loss all the way up to the moon, all the way back down. The propagation distance, so the moon, it's about 80 kilometers, I believe, round trip. The angle of reflection, so for the moon, how we're reflecting, where that bounces back down. We also did meteor scatter and auroral and saw how that height varied and how that reflection angle varied with where we were transmitting. And then our frequency dependence. If we were staying in the 6 meter zone, we're going up to 2 meters, going up to gigahertz range, as we know with EME, with those big satellite dishes, how that would work with the study. So really what we found is there's actually, they all kind of follow the same general trends. So we looked at meteor burst communication. That's really popular on 144 megahertz. Earth, Moon, Earth, popular basically through all bands, 6 meters, 2 meters, 220 megahertz, 70 centimeters, and all the way up to 1.2 gigahertz. And then auroral propagation, which is a big focus in HamSCI. So really the basic theory, if you look at the bottom left of this poster, it's a lot of ionization reflection. So there's meteors or aurora that come through and they burn up, and it leaves these little ions, electrons up in the atmosphere. And we reflect, transmit off of those and reflect those back down to Earth. And electrical surfaces, so electrically reflective. The moon kind of acts the same. It's electrically reflective, reflecting those radio signals. We actually found that it had a high, very low reflection coefficient, something like 0.065 for reflection. So it's a very weak signal, as we saw. And so the first thing we did was meteor burst communication. We looked at the path loss and the gain for the whole thing. We found that it's dependent on both antennas. Obviously, it's also dependent on the wavelength, but the most thing it's dependent on are these atmospheric loss factors. If you look at this equation right here on the middle left, where my cursor is, you'll see 3 different A terms, and those are all atmospheric loss factors. So all those are dependent on a height of the meteor H. And that was the greatest way to increase or decrease your range for meteor burst, was lowering that meteor height. So meteor bursts can occur when you even can't see the meteors because they're electrically reflective. They don't need to be visible. But what we did is we actually used this equation and modeled it. And we found when we stick a central point, a west point, there's an optimal probability of meteors that you're going to be able to reflect off of. And we found that that was just around 50 kilometers. Definitely not right in the center. Obviously, if you point straight up, it's going to come straight back down. But the greatest probability of those meteors are going to be right around that middle. So I call it kind of a bundt cake model. If you think there's a hole in the middle, and then there's some height in the outside, and then back down to 0 on the outsides. So it's the most suitable propagation factors. Yeah, and so next we went to Earth, Moon, Earth. So it uses the moon as a reflective surface, 250 decibels path loss, which is extreme, and an 80,000 kilometer round, 80,000 kilometer round trip propagation distance. So we did the same thing with this loss equation. We found obviously it's dependent on both your antennas. You'll see some stations with 14 7-element Yagis or something and a kilowatt of power. We only have 100 watts and 2 stacked Yagis. So we're not as good as those stations, but it's got that reflection coefficient. It's also dependent on the distance to the moon and then the distance and the radius of the moon too. So what we found is it's very much different at perigee and apogee. There's a variation of about 3,000 kilometers, I want to say, from perigee to apogee. So actually this was October 20th, there was the ARL EME competition. The moon was at perigee or at apogee, and it was a full moon, so there were tons of contacts. That's an image right there, a PSK reporter on that night on JT65 on 2 meters, so you can see just the volume of EME contacts that were made. What we actually did was we took 2 stations from a different EME event, HI8DL from Puerto Rico, KU8Y from Michigan, and we saw that those propagation values given in PSK reporter were actually pretty close to the values we calculated using those loss equations. So had a total distance, 80,000 kilometers. It varied for each station. They used the 2-meter frequency that we found. Had an intense amount of antenna gain. We looked at the picture. We saw their station set up and calculated the gain for there. Both had extremely high power and an extremely weak reception strength. And then lastly, we looked at auroral propagation. So we weren't as lucky as this morning having that KP index above 6. But all of last semester, we weren't able to find a proper time to be able to analyze auroral propagation, especially because there's no set mode. So it's kind of hard to analyze how, on PSK Reporter, how that would work. We did see, obviously, as the KP index increases, you're going to have a greater chance of aurora. That's kind of the lesson of this whole conference. But there's a good graph from NOAA that shows as KP index increases, you'll be able to see the northern lights from lower and lower latitudes. And we also saw from a Dave Halliday's talk last year at HamSCI that auroral reflection is really only possible with KP above 4. So this morning probably would have been great if I was watching my K7RA solar update emails. So really what we found, I think that gives it a little bit bigger, kind of. I'm squinting my eyes to read it. But we found that all these different reflection modes are actually pretty similar in their reflection constants, their gain equations dependent on the antennas and the distance, the reflection coefficients, and their frequency dependency. So we actually saw that these change drastically or propagation conditions change drastically when subject to those space weather events. So we think analyzing and characterizing these events really allow for greater propagation forecasting and general understanding of these space weather effects. So we think being able to model this is going to help us out to find those optimal windows for finding those the weak signal VHF propagation. So yeah, I'll stand by for questions, but that's all I have.
Okay, yeah, we're a little bit, you ended a little bit early, so
Yeah.
we'll go with the questions after the last presentation, then we can open it up. So thank you, Nolan. And next is Pat, KD2SUE, and the title is The Oldest Cadet Club Today, W2KGY, and I'm sure he's talking about the West Point Cadet Club there in New York. So Pat, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Hello, everybody. I am just pulling it up right now.
Yeah, Nolan, can you unshare your screen?
One moment.
Yep, working on that.
There we go.
There we go.
Okay.
All right. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep. Yep. Sure.
All right, everybody. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of the West Point Amateur Radio Club. As Carl said before, we are the oldest continuously run club at West Point. You can see on the bottom, still wearing the same uniforms, different call sign. Now we're W2KGY. But again, we've been doing this for a long time, but our mission has changed just a little bit. As it says in the overview up here, of course, we're doing ham radio stuff, very basic things. We're doing a lot of outreach within the Corps, getting people involved. We've gotten about a dozen people licensed to speak on the air every semester. And these are people who have never even heard of or even thought about getting involved in radio before. That's a huge thing for us. Of course, since we are West Point, we are focused on military-focused training, and we're trying to get radios involved in that and, of course, reaching out to the Corps. So what we've done is we're doing a direction finding event similar to the fox hunt. We have a photo right here. This is a fox hunt we did in Newburgh, New York. But we'll be doing that here at West Point and getting more cadets involved so they can get familiar with these systems. And of course, here's a picture of some licensed cadets. And of course, you just heard from Nolan about some of the research he's doing. But I'd say the third big focus of our club is, of course, learning the science of radio itself and getting cadets involved with different research. This photo right here is from the BalloonSat project, which has been going on for quite a few years. And at a very basic level, it's getting cadets familiar with like how to run a research project and make an experimental test bed. And so with that, I wanted to keep that very brief, but if anybody has any quick questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you.
What kind of equipment do you have in the club station? Are you on HF too and everything?
Yeah, so that's actually a better question for Nolan. He's more familiar with the specifics of the equipment.
Okay.
I'm actually with him right now. He can speak. Nolan, the question was like specifically what kind of equipment do we have here?
Yeah, so we actually have a ton of HF and VHF equipment. So we just installed a mid-tri 40 up on the roof.
Okay.
Quite a nice rig. We have a flex radio and a maestro. I'm good. And then like an ICOM for our regular field usage. So we do both CW and still sideband. Our VHF rig, we actually used it to talk to Colonel Drew Morgan. You'll see some of the pictures down on the bottom while he was in the ISS. So usually the waiting list there is about 7 years. But if you went to school with a guy like our OIC, you just kind of shoot him a text. Yeah. So that was one of our great events there. And then we actually have a lot of vintage radios, some Collins and Heath kits from 1960. They're tube operated. So we think in an EMP event will be another emergency communication relay. Yeah.
Okay. What'd you do with the balloon?
What do we do with the balloon this year? That's a better question for Nolan. I was not involved on that project.
Yeah, so we're still doing it. We have a planned launch on April 24th. We're not allowed to leave post right now, so we can't launch it straight up because it'll go right into the Atlantic Ocean. We need to drive west a couple miles first. But it's going to have some whisper propagation beacons, I hope, for a presentation next year, hopefully.
All right. Very good.
All right. Well, if that's the end of the questions, thank you very much. Are we answering questions later?
Yes. Yes, this was the last session, so we'll just kind of open it up for any questions. And if you want to add them in the chat room or raise your hand, Diego and I can, I think, kind of control it a little bit so we don't all talk at once.
Okay, thank you very much. Does Alex have a question?
Yeah, I have a question for Jeanette, who did a presentation earlier, if that's okay.
Yes.
I'm getting into big data analysis just myself, and I was wondering if the analysis she did on sporadic E within the WSPR data, if there would be a way to somehow predict or alert hams that a sporadic E event might be imminent. You know, when you start to see the rise in spots coming in from 6 meters and 2 meters, I was wondering if there would be a mechanism there that hams could be alerted to that.
I'm not quite sure that you'd be able to find if an opening is imminent. The data that I was using, I downloaded it monthly, but if you use real-time data, you might be able to predict where an E-cloud is, or might be.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I was thinking of, I'm just thinking out loud here, like using a decision tree or something like that, that would set a threshold for certain areas within the country that would light up. And I don't know if you guys ever seen like that APRS map. I put a link into the in the chat earlier. That gives us a real-time view of where APRS stations are being heard between two stations, and it has a color code and gives what we call blobs. and it will give us an indication of where certain tropo might be available. And also sometimes with sporadic E, we will see this red blob expanding on the map. And it's very, very useful. And we can even use the 2-meter data to extrapolate that to what happens on 70 centimeters or even 1296. You know, you just sometimes have to wait a little longer before those bands become available. But it's quite interesting what you also can do with the APRS data. But, thank you for answering my question, Jeanette.
Yeah, thank you, Jeanette. And thanks for asking the question, Alex. Any other questions for any of the 6 poster people? Okay. Well, Diego, I think if there's no further questions, I guess there's a little blue leave room in the bottom right, at least on my screen, and I guess that'll take us back to the